You are listening to the global network of podcasters dedicated to the pharmacy profession. Welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
Welcome to Essential, the pharmacy compounding podcast with the latest news and analysis from, who better, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, the voice for compounding pharmacy. I'm Andrew Cantor, and today we've got questions about GLP-1 compounding, a problematic word in California, some FDA shenanigans, and more. Then we'll dive into one of the biggest issues facing the industry, FDA's out-of-left-field ban on natural thyroid products. But more on that in a little bit. Let's do this thing. We're going to be talking a bunch about GLP-1 compounding, but there's something I want to mention first because it's important. APC's been hearing this question a lot in the past couple of weeks. Can a 503B outsourcing facility prepare compounded drugs using GLP-1 APIs now that the shortage is over? The short answer is, let's put it this way. We don't know of any legal way the current situation would allow it unless we're talking about liraglutide, which is in shortage. But with semaglutide, tirzepatide, we don't see any legal way that 503B outsourcing facilities can prepare them. But, and this is important, we are not lawyers. So if you're at a 503A pharmacy and someone at a 503B says they can supply you with semaglutide or tirzepatide drugs that they prepare, even if your patient has a prescription, you should probably talk to a lawyer first. California. Your board of pharmacy may mean well, but it just has to make things complicated, doesn't it? Complicated and unclear. It always has to leave pharmacies guessing about what compliance looks like. Here's the latest. California just updated its compounding regulations. And there's one section that kind of mirrors what's in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And it's all about the term essentially a copy, which is obviously critical to compounding. The federal law says that a drug that is essentially a copy is one that, quote, produces for that patient a significant difference, unquote, from the commercial drug. California's new reg uses the phrase, quote, clinically significant difference, unquote. And the pharmacist has to verify and document that difference. So you've got significant difference in the federal law, clinically significant difference in California's new reg. Does adding the word clinically change things? Maybe. It might mean nothing, or it might mean that the California board can jump in, overrule the prescriber, the patient, and the pharmacist. We really don't know. Obviously, we'll be keeping an eye on it, and of course, we will let APC members know if California starts doing anything weird with that one-word change. In apparently breaking news, there is no FDA ban on GLP-1 compounding. There isn't. And it shouldn't be news. Why is it? Because there are a couple of drug makers out there, and our lawyers don't want us mentioning names, along with, we'll call them sock puppet groups that they fund, that are telling people it's illegal. They're telling patients, they're telling the media, they're telling regulators, they're even telling members of Congress. And, you know, it's hard for all those people to believe that a big company, a multinational company, would just outright lie. So when they got a letter or saw a press release, they believed it. And then some of them told their members, but it wasn't true. Yeah, the GLP-1 shortage is over, except for liraglutide. That's another issue. GLP-1 shortage is over, and compounders can't just dispense copies of semaglutide or tirzepatide anymore. Same as any other FDA-approved drug that's not in shortage. But just like any other drug, when a patient has a prescription for a legit custom formulation of a GLP-1, dosage form or a strength or some combo that's not commercially available, then yes, it can legally be compounded. That is literally what the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act says. It is the prescriber's call. The point is, there are some very clear and honestly pretty common scenarios where it's perfectly legal to dispense compounded semaglutide and tirzepatide. So that puts APC in the strange position of having to tell other professional medical organizations that they're giving their members incorrect information. Now, it's bad enough when a reporter believes the nonsense they're being told by these unnamed pharmaceutical companies. It's worse when legislators and regulators also believe it. If you're an APC member, by the way, you understand why we're always asking you to invest in our programs like Compact and our Legal Action Fund. And if you're not a member, this is a shameless plug. You ought to become one, a4pc.org. Here's something we just did. We rented a room on Capitol Hill, and we gave a briefing to about 25 staffers of U.S. senators and representatives. We gave them a primer on compounding. We explained when it's allowed, why it's done. We even brought in a real-life compounding pharmacist to talk about what it's like on the front lines, give them a real-world perspective. It was a ton of work, and it is incredibly frustrating because the only reason we have to do it is because these people are being deliberately misled. But here we are, and we're going to keep teaching and correcting and pushing back. Oh, something we absolutely love? When a compounding pharmacist invites a congressperson or a senator for a pharmacy tour, that is a huge deal. That kind of one-on-one or one-on-staff meeting, that's gold. You cannot beat that kind of educational opportunity. In the last few weeks, we know of at least 3 compounding pharmacies that have had their local representatives come for a visit, take a tour, see the labs. There was Pencol Pharmacy in Denver, Acacia Apothecary in Tucson, and Wells Pharmacy in Ocala, Florida. These congresspeople, they walked out knowing a lot more than when they walked in, and that kind of relationship can pay off big time. If you take a look at our show notes, by the way, there is a link to APC's guide to hosting a legislator. We got you covered. So, all this outreach, it works. We've pushed the FDA so often about addressing the confusion around GLP-1 compounding that, you got it, the agency actually sent out a communication a few weeks ago specifically about the subject. And wouldn't you know it, they got it right. They made it clear that GLP-1 compounding was legal in the usual circumstances, and that compounded drugs may have a higher risk profile, but they're not inherently unsafe. There's a difference between legit compounding and those little pop-up wellness center sites. You know it, we know it, and now the FDA says they know it too. And then there's the media. We'll be honest, when it comes to writing about compounding, they don't always get it right. Every time a reporter calls a compounded drug a knockoff, we're convinced a kitten loses a whisker. The problem is these companies, and you know who they are, they're feeding reporters misinformation in writing, in press releases. By the way, we used to call it lies, but these days we're more polite. It's misinformation. And of course, compounding is complicated, so we try not to get too frustrated, at least not with the reporters. The good thing is, bit by bit, the mainstream media is starting to get the story right. And yes, we will brag a little. We've spent a lot of time writing to reporters, writing to editors, and telling them, what you wrote, it's not exactly what you'd call correct. And they're getting the message. And you can always help, If you read an article or you see a news story that just gets it wrong, it's absolutely worth it to reach out to the reporter or to the editor, let them know. Be polite, be friendly, give them the facts. We actually have a section on our website called APC in the News, where we link to the stories we've been quoted in. And every one of those could be a reporter who just got a whole new perspective on pharmacy compounding. It is a slow process, but it is working. If only we could stop them from calling compounded drugs knockoffs and copycats. That is a miracle we are still working on. All right, we are going to switch gears now and get to the main topic of today's episode. On August 6th, the FDA did a weird thing. It declared that desiccated thyroid extract, DTE, was now classified as a biologic, and patients had 1 year to transition to something else. And that's not just drugs with compounded DTE, it's commercial drugs that use DTE too. And this is a problem on a lot of levels. The reality is, the FDA has no business just declaring DTE a biologic and making it off limits. Well, that's why we've got a couple of folks here who are going to talk about why the ban is just so wrong.
DTE, or desiccated thyroid extract, also known as animal thyroid products, have been around since the late 1800s, before the formation of the Food and Drug Administration, and have been used by patients to treat hypothyroidism, which is a disease where the body doesn't produce enough thyroid hormone since, 1890. So to have these drugs be changed in their classification where they're going to be less available for patients could be hugely problematic.
That's Tennille Davis. She is APC's Chief Advocacy Officer.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm a pharmacist too by trade. Before I came on at APC, I treated patients at a pharmacy for 16 years, and I have a lot of experience dispensing and compounding with these animal thyroid products.
I think it's worth pointing out as well that the DTE or the ADT or whichever these abbreviations are getting used, depending on the FDA letter that we've seen, most compounders are probably familiar with this as thyroid USP.
That's Matt Martin. He's a pharmacist, an APC board member, and VP of Clinical Services at PCCA.
That's right, Matt. Thyroid USP is made from the dried, ground up thyroid glands of either pigs or cows. In the United States these days, it's primarily pig or porcine thyroid hormone that's desiccated or dried and ground up, that's being formulated into either compounded capsules or into pressed tablets made by drug manufacturers in certain doses that are standardized for patients.
So this was interesting to see FDA take this approach in August, but this isn't the first time that this topic has come up. A few years ago, FDA sent a letter to NABP, the National Associations of Boards of Pharmacy, with the same idea that DTE, as it was referred to at the time, was going to be a biologic. And so this is not, a typical course of action that I would expect. And there was a lot of feedback, a lot of concern, a lot of uproar about what would happen to the compounding of DTE, of thyroid USP at that time. And ultimately, FDA sent a letter from Gail Bormel, who's the director of the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance at that time, saying, hey, we sent this letter to NABP, but those products are still available. We're certainly going to do our risk-based inspections and related to things like quality, that type of issue, but it kind of dropped the issue. So I think, based on that letter and that series of events, a lot of people would have thought that this issue had been closed, and yet what is old is new again.
So what's the normal process if the FDA wants to declare something as a biologic and thus can't be compounded with? I mean, is it just it makes a statement, now it's a biologic? I would assume there's some kind of process involved.
Yeah, a biologic has a specific definition from the FDA where it's a sequence of amino acids greater than 40 amino acids in length. And what they're saying is that the thyroid USP, because it contains an excipient that's naturally present in these animal thyroid glands called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is a large protein. It has more than 40 amino acids. So it in itself would be, biologic if it was pharmacologically active, which it's not. So thyroglobulin is an excipient or an inactive ingredient that ends up being in thyroid USP. The active ingredients are small molecule drugs called T3 and T4, or liothyronine and levothyroxine. Those are the thyroid hormones, and those are the active ingredients in DTE. So this thyroglobulin, which is a protein, is an inactive ingredient. And FDA has said itself that the presence of a protein or a biologic as an inactive ingredient in a substance does not make that substance automatically a biologic. Like human albumin is an example that FDA gives as a biologic product that sometimes exists in pharmaceuticals that does not make the finished pharmaceutical a biologic instead of a drug.
What Neil's referring to was guidance after some changes were made back in 2020. So back then, there was a process instituted for FDA to transition several drugs to becoming biologics products. This was based on a law passed a number of years before that. And I think the intent of that law, at least when it was passed, was the hopes of making cheaper insulin become a reality, because there's a difference between a generic drug product and a biosimilar, which is kind of like a generic for a biologic drug, but has some technical differences that I don't know that are worth getting into for the purposes of what we're talking about. And I don't know that became the reality that there was cheaper insulin. But regardless, this was all stemming from that, and so guidance related to that transition period of drug products to biologics is what Tennille was speaking to, where they said, hey, when the protein is in there, it doesn't make, as an inactive ingredient, it doesn't make it a biologic at that point. So it's a little hairy to step through, because we're talking about things that have not really been important to the product, despite these DTE products having been around for decades and decades. Nobody's really spent time talking about thyroglobulin until now. It's not something that's listed in the package insert of the product. If you look up the USP monograph, so one of the criteria for the way you can use something as an active ingredient and compound is to say it has a USP monograph. Okay, thyroid has a USP monograph. That's why we talk about thyroid USP, meaning that the United States Pharmacopoeia has set standards for that chemical. Standards include tests that have to be performed on that chemical, and there's no test or listing or requirement for the quantity of thyroglobulin. So a substance that's never really been discussed until that first FDA letter a few years ago, and now in the notice that was provided to companies in August, now points to thyroglobulin as sort of the central issue as to why all of a sudden these products need to be biologics instead of drugs.
So, are there other examples besides thyroglobulin that, by the FDA's new logic, well, not new logic, but by what the FDA is saying, that could also be suddenly classified as biologics, even if they're inactive ingredients? As in, has the FDA opened a door to a Pandora's box, if I may mix my metaphors, of other drugs suddenly being classified as biologics?
It's really hard to say. And one of the things that we're also aware of is that this seems to have come from a push from one singular pharmaceutical company. So in 2024, a pharmaceutical company that manufactures commercially available animal-based thyroid tablets sent a citizens petition to the FDA asking the FDA to kind of crack down on unapproved manufacturers of animal thyroid products. We have to remember that these have been around since, the late 1800s. They preceded the formation of the FDA. So they don't have formal FDA approval. They're grandfathered in. So they existed and treated patients before the FDA regulated drugs. So this pharmaceutical company submitted a citizen petition basically asking the FDA to crack down on, say, unapproved marketing of these kind of thyroid medications. And the FDA, a year later, just this past August, came back and partially granted the citizen petition and partially denied it, and basically said that thyroid products were a biologic and that a pharmaceutical company would have to go through the biologic drug approval process to keep these products on the market. So the biologic process is called getting a BLA, or a biologics license, is going to get FDA formal approval for these products if this happens, but it's down the biologics pathway instead of the drugs pathway, which is a more complicated FDA approval process. Likely what end up happening is this one pharmaceutical company will end up the only one that is, partially down this BLA pathway. And so that at the end of the year, when this enforcement period ends, where the FDA is, allowing patients to transition to other thyroid products, that they'll be the only manufacturer on the market that has FDA approved animal thyroid drugs. Compounding pharmacies are not allowed to compound with biologics. So this one pharmaceutical company, if this plays out in the way that we think it might, would effectively have a monopoly in the marketplace.
So that citizens petition that Tennille brought up, FDA did respond to a citizens petition saying that they weren't going to take specific actions relative to the citizens petition, and this asks for enforcement, that they go through risk-based enforcement, which is pretty common type of language that you see from FDA. I will note the individual from FDA that responded to the citizens petition is a gentleman named George Tidmarsh. Now, George is an interesting person based on his comment on LinkedIn for several months preceding this response that he happened to be the signature on, because he said flat out, and I quote, "The new FDA needs to remove harmful, useless drugs from the market. Let's start with desiccated thyroid extract, an unapproved crude pig tissue extract that is proven worse than synthetic thyroid hormone and harmful. Working with the new FDA to remove it permanently from the market." End quote. So I have no idea what role this individual may or may not have played in the process. I'm just simply noting two things: that they are the person named on the response to the citizens petition, and that was their quote that they would seemingly have been the person that posted on LinkedIn.
Is any of that true?
Well, animal drug thyroid products are not the first choice to treat patients. So patients with hypothyroidism, the first choice is to prescribe synthetic thyroid hormones, levothyroxine, and or liothyronine. But those don't work for all patients. Some patients, even if their labs show that their thyroid hormones are at the right level, they just feel crappy. And switching them to these animal thyroid products makes a big difference in how they feel. So this is not the first choice. It's not the primary thyroid therapy used by American patients, but for the small subset that need these medications, they're very, very important. And the patients that take them are, desperate to retain access to these medications for their treatment.
I think we have to talk about the thyroid products, and when he mentions that they are unapproved in that statement, and in some ways that's true, and in some ways it's not, and so it's a technicality a little bit. So these thyroid products have been around for many, many years, and so they're around prior to 1962. Why does that date matter? That's when drugs not only had to be proven effective, but they had to be proven safe. So there have been a handful of drugs that have been grandfathered. So they're known as DESI drugs that were around prior to 1962. These thyroid products, the DTE, animal-derived thyroid products, are all are this type of drug. And so in the last, 10, 15 years, it does seem like FDA has gone through some processes and removed some of those products from the market, or reviewed some of those other products and found out maybe some of those products aren't necessary. So in some ways, this is sort of the continuation of that pattern. We can all argue about whether the products are good, bad, or indifferent, but just to say this history exists. So where you look for an FDA-approved drug product, a thing that is specifically a drug, not a biologic, FDA has these different color books that are online. I don't know who picked the color scheme. Don't ask me how that works. But the orange book is where you find FDA-approved drug products. The purple book is for biologic products. And there's a green book too, and that's for animal drugs, and that's a discussion for another day. But if you go into the FDA orange book and you search thyroid, which would be the name of the active ingredient, you're not going to return any products. Same thing for the purple book. So there is no fully FDA approved thyroid product on the market. It exists because it's one of these grandfathered products that existed prior to this date in the 60s.
Now, if the two of you would just for a second put on your pharmacist hats, which I assume you're actually wearing most of the time anyway, the question of whether compounded thyroid extract works. George, as you said, indicated that they don't work, they're ineffective. But that's not true, is it? I mean, from your experience, Tennille, you mentioned there are some patients where the commercial product didn't work. the compounded version does work, right? I mean, you can't say it's ineffective. You can say it's unapproved, as Matt just explained, but there's no question that this stuff works. These drugs work for patients. Is that right?
These drugs absolutely work for patients, and it's not just compounded therapies. So these animal drug products there's commercial manufacturers of these animal drug products that you can get prescriptions filled for these at your corner, retail drugstore. But for patients that need customized strengths or excipients or dosage forms, compounding pharmacies also make specialized or customized formulations of these based on a prescriber's order. I would imagine there's a lot more of the commercial tablets being dispensed than compounded animal drug products, but compounding is, a part of this market as well. And these absolutely work. There's change.org petitions to keep these products on the market since patients have got a hold of this issue since the letter came out in August. And patients are absolutely rabid that this therapy not be taken away from them.
So there is some time where all this is going to play out. This is not; these drugs have not been removed from the market as of now. All right. So that August 6th letter, FDA said that they were going to give 12 months of what they called enforcement discretion before they would take issue with anyone for dispensing the manufactured drug products or for having compounded and dispensed the compounded thyroid USP preparations. However, we have had some pharmacists start to report that some of the pharmacies in their area have started to tell patients that they are no longer carrying and can no longer dispense to them the manufactured products for some of the community pharmacies. So it looks like some people are making decisions to go ahead and just move away from this. So this is going to start to create some access issues, I think, just because of the number of places it may be available. There has also been some confusion around this topic, and I think you all have nailed this in the discussion that this is specifically about thyroid USP. This is not about levothyroxine and liothyronine. I had one pharmacist in particular tell me that they were having some pharmacies who were transferring their levothyroxine and liothyronine prescriptions to them because they were believing that they could no longer dispense those drugs either. So some people have misunderstood, misread this whole thing. Hopefully that's a limited number of people, but I want to make sure that we note that so that people are not confused. FDA's logic about having this 12-month enforcement discretion period was so that patients could be transitioned to levothyroxine or levothyroxine and liothyronine or whatever might work for those patients, or at least let them try some things. Certainly, as Tennille has stated, some patients just do better based on my own personal experience in serving the needs of those patients. Some people just seem to do better on thyroid USP products, whether they were manufactured or compounded was not necessarily the point, but they seem to do better. I mean, just based on what I observed.
So, Tennille, I mean, if as Matt says, there's some time before this takes effect, what can people do?
Yeah, so for people that may be affected by this change, a resource on our website to help educate them about this issue and then also help with something to do, a call to action. So if patients want to visit compounding.com/thyroid, or pharmacies can, send their patients or prescribers to that page, it'll have information about this issue. And then also a place for patients to fill out a letter to send to the administration to ask them to reverse this decision to classify natural thyroid products as a biologic. If the agency reverses this decision, then everything goes back to normal. If they want to pursue approval of thyroid products, we are not opposed to FDA approval of animal thyroid products, but we do need it to go down the FDA drug approval pathway, not the biologic approval pathway. So anyway, we're going to have information on the website to explain this issue to patients, and then a way for them to fill out a form to submit information to the administration to ask them to do the right thing, keep natural thyroid products as a drug, not a biologic.
Terrific. Thank you, Tennille. Thank you, Matt, both for being here and talking about this issue. So that's what's up right now with the whole DTE thyroid situation. Obviously, it's a major priority for APC. In fact, we talked to Congress about it, literally face to face at Compounders on Capitol Hill on September 16th. And as Tennille said, though, we need help from the compounding community. If you're a pharmacist, please tell your patients about compounding.com/thyroid. If you're a patient, well, that is the place to go to give a testimonial, explain how important thyroid extract has been for you. That will be linked in the show notes, by the way, in case you didn't write that down. But we're hoping to get as many people as possible to give us testimonials that we can use and we can share, and we won't share your personal information, of course, and to write to Congress and to put pressure on the FDA to make the right decision. So compounding.com/thyroid, it makes it really easy to do all these things. And with that, well, this has been Essential from the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding. You can find more information about us, and more importantly, join, if you aren't already a member, at a4pc.org. And we'll see you next time.